Good evening. Thank you all for making the time to be here tonight. My name is Malka Simkovich, and I'm the director of CTU's Catholic Jewish Studies program. Before I begin, I want to thank a few people who have made tonight's program possible. In particular, I don't know if I'll find all of you, Mr. Peter Cunningham, Associate Director of CTU's Bernardine Center. The Bernardine Center houses a number of different programs, including the Catholic Jewish Studies program and also our Catholic Muslim Studies program. And Peter is the engine that makes everything run. There he is in the back. He doesn't ask for accolades, but he deserves them. Thank you very, very much, Peter. Dr. Steve Millies, the director of the Bernardine Center, who unfortunately was unable to make it tonight. Ms. Carmen Salas and Ms. Yolanda Cortez, our events coordinators, our marketing team, Mr. Ron Brown with the camera, and Ms. Colleen Urbaniak, and many, many others who work every single day to make the school what it is and to make this evening in particular a success. I also want to recognize those of you who are coming to us this evening from outside of the CTU community, and particularly to Dr. Nirenberg's friends and colleagues in the audience. We want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Besides being the Dean of the University of Chicago's Divinity School and Distinguished Service Professor of Medieval History in the Committee of Social Thought, I hope I got that right, the Committee on Social Thought. I should practice this at home. Dr. Nirenberg is the author of dozens of articles, 3 edited volumes, 5 books, and many of those books have been translated into other languages. Of particular note is his 2013 book that I'm sure you've all have heard of and read, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, a book that demonstrates the ways in which societies have constructed images of Jews that have served as objects of blame for the problems which plague their societies. Unfortunately, Dr. Nirenberg's scholarship on this subject has grown only more urgent since its publication. Tonight's lecture, Christianity Thinks with Judaism, promises to be stimulating and pertinent, and I invite you to stay after the lecture for a brief Q&A conversation. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. David Nirenberg. Thank you.
It's very hard to speak in front of so many learned people about things that are difficult, that are deep, and about which many of you know more than me. I see people from whom I have learned. The Talmud says that to speak authoritatively before people who know more than you merits the death penalty. I'd like to thank, above all, Professor Malka Simkovich. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here, and all of her colleagues at CTU. Let me begin. I'm going to talk about several thousand years of how Christianity thinks with Judaism, and I may scandalize you by the breadth of the things I'm going to say. So I want to begin, like every professor does, by defining every word in their title. Christianity. I mean, of course, the entire history of Christianity and all of the various sects. And sect is not a dirty word in religious studies. Sects of Christianity. But I don't mean only Christianity. I mean everything that has flowed from Christianity. From every movement that has learned from it. That includes Islam. That includes Hegelian idealism. That includes Marxism. It includes many later movements that borrowed ideals and ways of thinking from Christianity. There's very little, I think, in the present world that can truly be said to owe nothing to Christianity, to be entirely untouched by it. And everything that has been touched by Christianity, that has learned from or even violently rejected it, may also have been touched by how Christianity thinks with Judaism. Oh, thinks. I don't just mean the present tense. I mean the past tense too. In fact, past and present are deeply intertwined in Christianity because the past is exemplary for the present. And this isn't true only of Christianity. It's true also of Islam and Judaism. That's why historians of religion often call these historical religions, because history, the vast archive of the past, of how believers in the past have behaved, is a source of instruction for believers in the present, which means also a source for shaping the future. So when I say thinks, I mean across all of time and interactive with all of time. And you know, of course, I don't need to illustrate this in a kind of obvious way by saying the vulgar expression, what would Jesus do? Right? This notion in which the past, figures of the past, are exemplary for every believer in every future. Or if you want to use the term of art that theologians in Germany developed from Greek, these are charismatic religions. These past moments acquire meaning to orient the life of every believer in every future. So thinks in all time. I told you I needed to define every word. With. Well, not really with. I'm not going to be talking, and I'm sorry to Mark, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm not going to talk at all about real Jews. You're not going to learn anything about Jewish thought. But I'm not going to be talking about how Jews and Christians have had dialogues with each other, which they have had, and which are very important. I'm going to be talking about how Christianity has at different points in time imagined for itself Jewish interlocutors with whom to debate the proper interpretation of God's creation and of God's teaching. Judaism. Well, I just said I'm not going to be talking about what Judaism as it really was or as it really is, nor even necessarily about any real Jews, but rather I'm going to be talking about ideas about Judaism. Sometimes we call those stereotypes, sometimes we call them caricatures, that are useful for Christians or for anyone touched by Christianity, by which I mean Muslims, Marxists, and others, to think with. Ideas about Jews to think with. So let me give you an example. Karl Marx. I said I wanted to try scandalize, so I'm going to treat him as a Christian thinker. And you might say, well, Karl Marx, he was descended from Jews, but remember, he converted to Protestantism when he was 6, and so did his entire family. So money is the god of Judaism. On this topic, his keeping was in touch with much older Christian ideas about Jews and money, about Jews and materialism, and those ideas had roots in very early Christian communities, which we can talk about. So I just mentioned him as an example of ideas about Judaism that are not necessarily about real Jews. I hope no one really believes that the God of Judaism is money, but it's a very powerful idea that has had a long history across both Christian and post-Christian thinkers. So Christianity not only learned to think with and against Judaism, but it also acquired the capacity to generate its object of thought. That is, it acquired the capacity to think about Jews even when there were no Jews around. Why? Well, here I'm going to return to this question of sects, the sectarian function of thinking about Judaism. Christianity, like Islam, and like many other groups within these faith families, had to explain how it was related to, but different from, better than, other sects of Judaism, other interpreters of the Israelite prophetic traditions with whom early Christians were competing as they made their claims to be true followers and interpreters of God's words. Maybe the best description of this process is to be seen in Life of Brian, a movie which people my age really like, but which younger people no longer remember. And it's true, we don't know as much about these groups as they actually were, as we would like. And a lot of what we do know is mediated by early Christian texts. Think of the representation of the Sadducees and the Pharisees in the Gospels. But these groups included temple authorities, early synagogal Judaism, the Qumran community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, and many others. So in order to make this claim that their interpretation, this particular group's interpretation, was better than other groups' interpretations of the scriptures of Judaism, they had to think constantly about their relationship to the earlier prophetic texts that we call today the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. And to the Jews, the relationship to the Jews who were or who claimed to be guardians of those texts. And we can see this thinking going on already in the earliest, well, not the very earliest, but in early texts of the tradition. So, for example, this is my favorite example, and I bring it up often, so forgive me if you've heard me talk about it before. The risen Jesus on the road to Emmaus. The risen Jesus, well, I shouldn't tell you he's the risen Jesus because the people he appears to, who had been followers of Jesus, don't know it's the risen Jesus when he appears to them. But he sees two followers walking on the road to Emmaus, and they're very downcast. And he asks them why they're downcast. And they explain that they had thought that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, the promised Savior of Israel, but that he had been crucified, and so he couldn't be. And then Jesus, on the road, proceeds to explain to them all of the texts and the prophecies that were about him. In other words, the first thing, or maybe the second thing that the risen Jesus has to do is to reinterpret for his followers the scriptures of a tradition that had been normally or were typically interpreted differently by other groups. So this is what I mean when I say the sectarian task. The sectarian task is to propose new interpretations, make sense of the old. And of course, the Quran does exactly the same thing in a very different way. Muhammad doesn't appear on the road to Emmaus. He's revealed new versions of many of the stories of the Hebrew Bible. This process of sectarian competition often meant projecting negative attributes onto figures of Judaism. Pharisees, for example, in the Gospels. So this is a rival sect about whom we don't know as much as we wish we did know. And you see here them being described as hypocrites, whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but inside full of dead men's bones. Now, when I say you shouldn't take these texts to be descriptions of how the Pharisees really were, I think it's obvious that they probably wouldn't have understood themselves in this way, right? Now, all of these choices, every choice made about how to represent these figures of Judaism in early Christian texts in order to relate early Christians to the scriptural tradition, every one of those moves has immense implications for the future. An obvious one, almost too cheap to offer you, is the definition of the word Pharisee from the Oxford English Dictionary. Pharisee, hypocrite. Paul referred to the Jews as slaves, or he mapped them onto to terrestrial. He referred to terrestrial Jerusalem as he mapped it onto in an allegory onto slavery, and also in his letter in the Epistle to the Romans, he talked about may their eyes grow so dim that they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. This allusion to slavery has a long history through Augustine all the way into the Middle Ages when the Jews become slaves of the king's chamber. So the special protected status by which Jews made it into the Middle Ages was taking slavery from Paul. Augustine did a lot of the interpretive work and creating a new status of Jewish slave in the Middle Ages. Here I have an image from Burgos of synagogue blindfolded. This is another figuralization, literalization of their may eyes be blinded. So the idea that the Jews have blind eyes is one that has, a long future in art, in thought. I'm just trying to make the point that every word that's used to try relate the new emerging community to the Hebrew scriptures and the people who claim to guard it is going to have a long future for how Christianity and the world can think with Judaism. It could even lead to this struggle over who is right, who has the true claim to the Hebrew scriptures, produces all kinds of oppositions. So to take another one from Paul, there's the carnal Israel and the spiritual Israel. This is a famous and very important distinction which makes possible a huge amount of very creative thought. But it also makes it possible to imagine that actually Jews have a different lineage from Christians or Gentiles. So, for example, here's a famous passage from the Gospel of John that will be used in many different ways in many different periods. But it's, for example, in the Middle Ages, Alonso de Spina will take this passage to argue that Jews are not descended from Adam and Eve. They're descended from Adam and Lilith. So we really have two totally different lineages, and that's why you need to have purity of blood laws in Spain. That's why you need to have prohibitions on intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, etc. Just trying to give you a sense of how so many of these passages that are deployed in a particular competitive context have long futures about that dictate the possibilities of existence and of coexistence for Christians and Jews in the future. So a general point I'd like to make is that for early Christians, Judaism and Judaizing came to mean a mistaken way of relating to the world and to God. A basic confusion of priorities between the material and the spiritual, between the real and the ideal. It became a basic concept with which to make sense of the world, with which to make this distinction between matter and spirit, between orientation to matter and orientation to spirit. And I want to stress that that distinction, in which the Jew stands for an orientation to the material that is wrong, that doesn't see the spiritual, that's blind to the spirit, is not only about Jews alone. It's not applied only to Jews alone. It's so useful because it can be applied to anyone who's confronted with the choice between matter and spirit and makes the choice wrong. I'm going to keep on stressing, if thinking about Jews were only useful when you encounter a real Jew, it wouldn't have been good for much, because there were very few real Jews in the ancient world, just like there are very few real Jews today. It had to become a way of thinking about the whole world in order to become really powerful, in order to be transmitted across time. How did that happen? Well, I'll give you an example. Another passage from the New Testament, from one of the earliest surviving texts from the Jesus movement, Galatians 2:14. Now here Paul is talking to Peter. So I'll call them one apostle talking to another apostle. And Paul says to Peter, they're debating whether the converts from Gentile converts to Judaism should have to follow any of the laws of Judaism, kashrut, circumcision, etc. And Paul says to Peter, since you, though you're a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to Judaize? He actually calls Peter a hypocrite, which is a very powerful word, and which later church fathers spent many pages wondering about. How could one apostle call another apostle a hypocrite? But the point here is that he's using the word Judaize, Judaizare, Judaizein in Latin and Greek, to characterize a Gentile convert, not a Jew, a Gentile convert's inappropriate relation to the laws and customs of a tradition. And that became shorthand for a logic that could make sense of any Christian's incorrect relationship to the flesh, to matter, to the world, to the law, to the letter of Scripture in terms of Judaism. It's this power of criticizing any believer's relationship to the world in terms of Judaism that made thinking about Jews a key concept in first Christian thought and then Islamic thought and Western thought as a whole. A concept that constantly evolved across the late antique, medieval, early modern periods to the present. Now, I'm not going to tell you much about that because I've written thousands, hundreds of pages about it, but I profess to be able to tell you how anything at all can be thought of in terms of Judaizing, even eggplants. And there is a page in my book, Anti-Judaism, on how eggplants came to be associated with Judaizing. But all I want to leave you with here is that this process of thinking with Judaism made it possible for Christians to generate the Judaism of anyone or anything in the world and to use it to think about their world in a critical way, to criticize their world and try and improve it. I'll give you one example, and I use this example often, so forgive me. This is all lots of different pictures of Shylock. But my example will be Shakespeare. And I don't want to weigh in on the heated debate about whether Shakespeare was Catholic or Protestant. I just want to give you a quick example of how he thought with Judaism. So we can agree he's a Christian and he's thinking with Judaism. Now, Shakespeare lives in an England that hasn't seen a living Jew for hundreds of years. The Jews were expelled from England in the 1290s. They're not going to be readmitted until the 17th century. Shakespeare will never see one, and no one around him has seen one. There might be a stray convert around, someone who's fleeing the Spanish Inquisition, something like that. But he has a set of problems he wants to think about. And those sets of problems involve topics that people often associate with Christianity had learned to think about in terms of Judaism. So what are some of those topics? Money lending, contracts and law. There's a lot of more technical ones, like whether one person can stand surety for another, but I don't want to go. Let's just take money lending and law. Money lending and the interpretation of texts, right? When Shakespeare is living in a society whose economy is in rapid transformation, lending of money at interest became legal right before Shakespeare wrote this play. Shakespeare's father went to jail multiple times for usury, for being a Christian who lends money at interest, right? So all of a sudden, lending money at interest is legal. What distinguishes this new Christian money lending from the old usury that used to be illegal? How do you moralize it? How do you decide what's the difference between a Christian and a Jew, between a good moneylender and a bad one? That's the problem that this expanding society that Shakespeare's living in has to decide on, right? And when it has to decide on such a massive problem, which is as big as any transformation of our own economy, it turns to thinking about Judaism, not because there's Jews around lending money, there are none, but because Christian thought has learned to think about these problems in terms of Judaism. So he builds a figure of Judaism, Shylock, against whom he can pose another figure, Antonio, and debate what's the difference between the merchant and the Jew. Remember the famous line that the judge asks when she comes up on the stage? Which is the merchant here and which the Jew? As if there could be any confusion. In fact, the Al Pacino version of the play in New York cut the line out because it's so hard to stage. Everyone knows who the Jew is. It should be obvious. But the line is so important because it's telling you what Shakespeare wants you to walk away with, which is thinking about Judaism is the way in which you learn to differentiate between what the good that you want to do as a Christian and what you should not do. I'll give you an example of this. From a different poet. It's just the pithiest example I can think of this logic. From a Protestant poet, this time, George Herbert, writing around 1633. So right a little generation after Shakespeare. It's from a poem called Self-Condemnation, which I love. I love the title, first because I'm hard on, we're all hard on ourselves, and second because it points to what the poem is about. The Christian, the Protestant's self-critique. How do you become a better person? By criticizing yourself and your own spiritual orientation. And here's the lesson. He that doth love, and love amiss this world's delights before true Christian joy, hath made a Jewish choice, and is a Judas Jew. So you can see here how the Christian, and this is not a minor poet, this is one of England's greatest poets, as is Shakespeare, is using Judaism to criticize the self, to criticize the Christian self. It's as if Paul's passage in Galatians 2:14 has put a little Jewish Jiminy Cricket in every Christian against which the Christian's conscience has got to evaluate itself. That's what I mean when I say Christianity thinking with Judaism. Now, I don't mean to imply that these figures of Judaism and Christian thought don't affect real Jews? Of course they affect real Jews. Once Jews re-enter England, and the British are in the 18th century debating the Jews' bill about whether Jews can vote, etc., Exhibit A in the argument of the people who want to say that Jews should not be allowed to have political rights in England is Shylock. And they say, how can you allow a people who have that kind of enmity towards us to be our political brethren? So Shylock, a figure of Judaism invented by Shakespeare to think about transformations in his economy, has now become a real Jewish enemy against whom the British people need to defend themselves. It's this interplay between thinking with Judaism and real Jews that is so powerful. If thinking about Judaism were only useful in places where there are real Jews, it wouldn't be very widespread, since again, many societies across time have had virtually no real Jews in them. This is why Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, famously said that if Jews did not exist, the anti-Semite would have to invent them. On the other hand, the existence of real Jews in the world, somewhere in the world, gives plausibility to the systems of thought that are built up by thinking with Judaism. And I want to suggest that it's only by taking seriously the logic behind this Judaizing discourse, this thinking with Judaism, that we can understand how and why so much of the world, Christian, Islamic, and secular, spends so much time thinking with Judaism. This is true even of those groups, the distinction between the work that thinking with Judaism does and the presence of real Jews, that distinction matters even for groups who to us seem most obviously obsessed with real Jews, such as the Nazis, who were perhaps the most relentless and the most successful impresarios of anti-Judaism, presenting their attack on the Jewish race as the emancipation of the world from Jewish thought. You all remember Goebbels' famous quote in 1933 at the celebration of the burning of un-German books, in which he said, "The age of rampant Jewish intellectualism is now at an end." In other words, all intellectualism is Jewish. You are all Jews. Now, we tend to forget that there were only about 500,000 Jews living in Germany in 1933, out of a population of about 67 million, so 0.75%. Attacking real Jews was so useful to the Nazis, not because they actually were this massive and numerous threat, immigrant threat to the Germany of the day, but because Europeans had for so long learned to criticize so many aspects of themselves and their culture in terms of Judaism. So this was true of just about anything you could find in the 20th century. Europeans knew how to criticize it in terms of Judaism. Economic systems, capitalism. For the Nazis, and not only for the Nazis, capitalism was Jewish. Marxism. For the Nazis, and not only for the Nazis, Marxism was Jewish. Massive ideological confrontations and economic confrontations understood by Europeans in the mid-20th century as a conflict between non-Jewishness and Jewishness. And I don't want to get into the debate about whether Nazi Germany was Christian or not. There's many wonderful people have written really important work, both about Protestant Germany and Catholic Germany in this period. So, and you could show for really any register of culture, any corner of culture in 20th century Germany, 20th century before 1945, and not only in 20th century Germany, in 20th century Europe, again, before 1945, how Judaism could be used to think, by non-Jews, to think about any aspect of society. Art, I'll give you the example of the famous Degenerate Art Exhibition of 1937, hosted by the Nazis, in which, really the best-selling exhibition of the 20th century to that point, in which of the 112 artists condemned as degenerate Jewish artists, only 6 were actually Jews by race. The others were Jews by their style, by the way in which a Nazi critic would say that modernist style is Jewish. They were Judaizing. Music, Hindemith, and many others condemned as Jewish, not because they were Jewish by race, but because in some way you could criticize their musicality as Jewish. Mathematics, whole journal, Deutsche Mathematik, set up to publish German versus Jewish mathematics. What's the difference between German versus Jewish mathematics? Actually, they had a very elaborated system that said that Jewish mathematics was excessively abstract, like abstract algebra. Set theory, had too many infinities. Jewish physics, Nature, the journal Nature in 1939 published an important paper by future Nobel Prize winning German physicist arguing about the difference between German physics, which was about experiment, and Jewish physics, which was about mathematics, think Einstein. So there was really nothing in culture that Christian Europe had not learned to think about, or Christian or post-Christian secular Europe had not learned to think about in terms of Judaism. Now, the Nazis succeeded in making much of Europe think with and against Judaism. But that success, that is, the Nazis' success in mobilizing much of Europe to attempt to murderously purge itself from the Judaism that afflicted it, that success can only be understood within a history that encoded the threat of Judaism into all of these basic concepts of Christian and post-Christian thought, regenerating that threat in new forms for new times and helping many of modern Europe's citizens, even its most educated and critical, make sense of their world. So what about today? This is where I've been scandalous to this point, but I'm going to get even more scandalous now, I think. And I'll try to explain why. I just, every day that passes makes me feel like scandal is needed. I'm here using scandal in Paul's sense. He used it about a scandal to the Jews and Greeks. Actually, Christ was a scandal. We too live in an age with Jewish questions. An age in which many millions, and in fact I would say billions of people, are exposed daily to some variant of the argument that the challenges of the world we live in are best explained in terms of Israel. And by Israel I mean everything. I mean Israel, Israelite, in many languages Israel means Jew. It doesn't mean the country. Many of these people who believe this live in regions without real Jews. Think of, for example, how Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban deploys George Soros as a figure of Jewish capital seeking to destroy Hungary by flooding it with Muslim refugees. Now, you might think that the connection between Muslim refugees in Europe and Jewish capital is a thin one, but it's obviously a potent political one, or it wouldn't be working so well and being deployed so powerfully in Hungary and many other places. Or think, for that matter, of the many Muslims in the world who do not live near Jews, who have learned to think that the pressing danger they confront is some form of Judaism. And I don't mean, one can think, for example, of Muslims in Tehran or in Cairo, but one can also think about why poor Muslim immigrants in Paris think that the instruments of their oppression, against whom they should most directly rebel, is not the majoritarian French society, but the Jewish widow living next door. The fact that most of this thinking is going on in countries that have no Jewish population does not, of course, mean that it isn't dangerous for real Jews. Similar thinking with Jews is going on here. I offer you this striking image because it brings together a few themes: invoking the medieval European past, invoking Judaism as a figure to be overcome by Christian identity, invoking our current politics with the red cap, and yes, invoking Goebbels, the age of the Jew is over, we now enter the age of kings, is a kind of paraphrase in a medieval version of the age of rampant Jewish intellectualism is at an end. We now enter the age of authentic Germanness. There are massive intellectual projects, I'll call them intellectual projects, such as Kevin MacDonald's Culture of Critique. Kevin MacDonald is often called the philosopher of the alt-right. I will say he has sold many millions of copies more than any of us academic authors will ever hope to achieve. For him, the Jews seek to destroy the world, and in particular the white world, the Christian world. And I don't mean to conflate white and Christian. It's just that for these thinkers, they're conflated. They're not conflated for me. By introducing, actually his list looks just like the Germans: psychoanalysis, deconstruction, civil rights, Marxism, immigration, homosexuality, etc. I mean, these are books that sell millions of copies. They're very influential today, insofar as he presents history as a war between all that is good and noble in the world, on the one hand, and the Jews on the other, and the Jews and their followers or dupes on the other. He's not very different from similar thinkers on the left, for whom the Jews represent colonialism, unfettered capitalism, neoliberalism, privilege, and I found this is a flyer that actually was put on a campus here in Chicago, a college campus. It says that ending white privilege starts with ending Jewish privilege, inequality, and injustice. Now, it may be that I'm being too dramatic in describing the thinking with Judaism that is going on today in the United States as a war. I've never thought this way before, and I'm not sure I'm thinking this way now. I don't know how literally I should take articles like this one from a US Nazi newspaper that greeted the publication of my book, Anti-Judaism, or how seriously I should take the young white man who stood up last year at a talk I gave in Connecticut at a Hillel and denounced me as an enemy of the white race. But the fact that that would happen today, I think, speaks to certain changes in... on the other hand, there is plenty of evidence that some in our country do see this as a war, and a war unto death. And hence I give you this image of the Tree of Life Synagogue. And there's also evidence that some of those people continue to draw inspiration from texts and ideas developed by some earlier Christian communities in order to make sense of their own world. And here I give you the last posting of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter in his social media site, gab.com. So I'd like to ask a question that historians, medievalists never ask, but as you can tell from the way I've been increasingly denouncing the present, that I'm impelled to ask it: what is to be done? And I think one of the reasons I feel impelled to ask it is because I was recently called to Menlo Park to consult with Facebook about their hate speech policy around religion. And it was a very interesting experience. I learned a lot. I can't say I left having any clearer sense of what is to be done, although I did write an article about it. That's what academics do. But clearly, not only me, not only you, but many different parts of this society are asking what is to be done. And I think the only answer I've really arrived at so far is that what is to be done is exactly what you are doing here, what you're doing here at CTU, what we historians, what you're trying to do, yes, you, in your programs in the University of Chicago. That is to say, try to put our understanding of the past to the work of the present and the future. Try to learn how Christianity, how Islam, how anything has thought with Judaism or with anything else. Because there are many hatreds in this world that deploy history. Facebook, for example, is very concerned with the use of its platform in Burma in generating a Buddhist Muslim genocide. We need to put our understanding, our study, our critical approach to how all of these moments in the past are put to work in the present. Will that work? Does that help? I don't know. But I think that all of us here, certainly everyone at CTU and everyone at the University of Chicago, has to believe that it does, because that is the tool that we have in these historical religions with which to achieve change for the future. That is, to put the past of those historical religions to the work of generating new examples, new meaning, and new possibilities for faith and for life. I welcome your questions.